Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. We are glad you're here for our webinar on the 8 supply chain planning red flags. My name is Heidi Chow. I'm the head of membership and business development of ASCII. Today, we will learn how to spot the most common supply chain planning red flags. As expert speaker, Ralph Stein has much experience in supply chain planning and is here to help you succeed. Please ask questions and share your own experiences. Thanks for joining us. Before we begin, we would like to remind you of a few house rules to ensure everyone has a positive and productive experience. First, if you have any questions or comments, please use the chat feature or Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window to share them with the group. We have prepared some poll questions. We'll share this with you during the webinar. And this webinar is being recorded. We will upload the recording to our YouTube channel after the webinar, and you're welcome to share with your colleagues and your friends. I appreciate your cooperation, and we hope you enjoy the webinar. Today, our expert speaker is Ralph Stein. Ralph is an associate member of Institute of Chartered Accountants of ANZ and has over 25 years of experience in finance and accounting, financial applications, reporting, transformation, change management, performance management, and analytical software space. He is currently the solution architect financial reporting applications at CCH Tagetik, specializing in the ESG reporting and supply chain process across Asia Pacific, where he is the AP lead. Now I will pass over to Ralph to start the webinar. Thanks, Ralph.
Thanks, Hetty. Basically, today we're going to be talking about the 8 supply chain planning red flags, and we're going to have a couple of poll questions throughout the presentation just to give me a bit of background about where people are at, and B, also what they're thinking about going down the future. So if let me go to the screen. Okay, do you want to Heidi, do you want to ask the 2 poll questions, please, first, before we get into this one?
Sure, I am launching the polls, so you should be able to see that. The audience should be able to see that. I am seeing responses. Thank you all of your participation. I see that we have about like 50% of people participated already, so we'll give it another minute, and then Ralph, you can share your comments.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to all those that have answered. I think might need to cut it off so we can just keep going. the answers are very much what I was expecting with the issues that people are seeing, and we'll be covering a lot of these topics today. And hopefully you'll find it very useful, some of the information that we are giving you. So I'll now end. Should I end the poll, Heidi? Oh, okay. So I'll just quickly share the results. So basically, as you can see, it's quite an even spread, but the frequent stockouts is something we'd very much expect in these times, given what's happened with COVID and the impacts on the supply chain. And then the disconnect between the different areas, which is a very big issue as well, which we will talk about, and also spreadsheet based. The second question was how much is digitized? And as you can see, most people are partially to moderate, which is also something we'd expect, but that's partially because in the past, supply chain hasn't had the focus that it used to have, well, it has now after COVID. So I'll just shut this down, do I? Okay. So basically what we are finding is that as I was saying about with the COVID and with the lockdowns and the war in Ukraine and all the other things that are happening around the world, we are actually seeing a very big impact on the supply chain. And it's getting the notice now that it never used to get in the past, or not as much, with the execs and the C-suite actually asking what's happening in this area, what are we doing, and trying to improve it. And part of that is because of the amount of data that's in spreadsheets, which we saw in the second poll question. And that means it's very hard to do quick turnarounds. It's hard to make sure you can drill down to data. It's very difficult to enable interactions between the different teams. So that's a very big impact. And also working from disconnected data sources. So that's partially from spreadsheets, but it's also because you've got a lot of siloed information, being data from sales, data from demand, production, distribution, finance, all working from their own forecast, and usually they don't meet, and that causes overall problems. Or somebody says, oh, my forecast is the one that's 100% correct. I'm not going to, what they're saying down there in the supply chain is totally incorrect. They don't know what they're talking about, when usually it's the other way around. I have got a finance background. I am a chartered accountant, as I said, but I do know that sometimes people in finance think about only one part of the organization, and they don't really look through and see how everything is impacted and how things flow through. Especially a marketing event might happen and people say, oh, that's going to have a 10% sales increase, and finance says, no, we want it to have a 20% because we want to hit a bottom line profit number. So they're making a change to the forecast based on the bottom line number they want, rather than really listening to what's happening in the company and making sure everybody's working together. So that's a very big thing with the disconnected data source. And manually inputting the information. I heard of an organization that used to be doing their budget, their planning for supply chain in a spreadsheet, and they had hundreds of spreadsheets, which were based on the different products, and then they had to make a change in one and have it flow all the way through. And rather than taking a few minutes, or it was taking days to try and get that turnaround, which makes it very difficult to then give the information to the people in the C-suite, because it's so difficult to tie it together. But we have seen that the companies that do something in this area and get more automated actually can improve their profitability. A number of reasons why that happens is, one, they can actually turn around the information a lot quicker. They can understand what the different drivers are and what the impact of changing those drivers are. Also, there's the relationship to marketing or a sales promotion. So you can actually see what's going to happen, or what if scenarios to see, okay, if we try this a little bit, or if we have a different distribution center and therefore the stocking something there, or are we overstocked in different areas? So for some examples, we heard of people who, especially during COVID, were finding that in one state in Australia, they were very much understocked, but in another state, they were overstocked, partially because of the lockdowns. So they were able to actually use the system to help them identify areas where they could transfer stuff internally rather than going outside and buying it from an external party if that's how they were doing it, or reducing the amount of raw materials because they could see, okay, we've got excess stock over there, therefore we know there's a delay in this particular raw material. We can actually transfer the goods, and also we can ensure that we can then get them the raw materials we need by the time that we want it. Because a lot of the systems, supply chain systems these days, you can actually put in lead times and know what's happening and sort of say, okay, well, this one's got a lead time of 3 months, this one's got a lead time of a month. So you can actually then work through the different implications on your actual production by looking at that data. So today we're going to be focusing on the 8 issues and how they can actually help you as an organization. Some of them you'll find you might already be doing, and some you might say, well, I hadn't thought about that, but maybe that's something we can do in the future. So, okay, next one. So the first one is looking at the lack of predictive planning. And basically what this happens is that companies are finding it very difficult to do predictive planning because a lot of it is manual, right? So if it's manual, how can you actually do predictive planning, especially when bringing into effect AI technology, which looks at the history and helps to forecast the future. And basically, if it's in a spreadsheet, that's not possible. And also by doing predictive planning, you can actually optimize your inventory, as I was talking about a bit earlier, because you're able to see where the stock is. And also if it's coming in from overseas, you can also say, okay, I know that this particular stock fills up 3/4 of the container, but I have got another stock that comes from the same source that, hey, if I put that on the same shipment, I'm actually going to be making sure I'm full the container up, which is very efficient. Especially as you guys know, and girls or ladies, the cost of containers has gone up dramatically. I was talking to somebody the other day and they were saying sort of pre-COVID to get a shipload of tyres sent to Australia was about 2,500. Now they're up at about 16,000 for the same type of things. And that was even a year ago, so it could even be higher now. So it's got a major impact on the organisation's profitability. And you need to look at how you can actually ensure that the data is providing you the right details of what you need to order, when you need to order it, to ensure that you are actually going to be not only satisfying the customers, but also making the necessary profitability. The other things that predictive planning can do is when you introduce a new product. So you can say, okay, this product B is going to replace product A. And so you can actually link them together and then say, okay, the history of A is going to come across to B. And that gives you a good starting point to see what's going to be happening in the future with that product and what you think you might need to produce and how you're actually going to achieve that details or the supply of that product. And also you can then look them through and say, okay, in the past we were using this particular product and we needed these raw materials. We also use those raw materials for other goods. So maybe we can now change how that's being done or look at how we're optimizing it, especially with the ESG reporting coming in and the environmental data coming in that's being collected. That also impacts on you in your planning to ensure that you're able to look at the opportunities for restructuring or how you're going to produce things that comes into the planning process and making sure that you're looking across the whole organization and also taking into account what the sales teams are saying and what the marketing team is saying, as well as finance, because it all comes into the same play. And that way you can ensure that you're looking at the overall end-to-end process and maybe ensure that you can have the necessary manufacturing either internally or overseas to meet the sales and the projections that you have after choosing the best fit. Not maybe the one that has the best profitability, even though that sometimes is what people want to see. You've got to be realistic in the current environment about what you can actually deliver based on what is happening in the market. So for example, if something's taking, especially with China, when they were in lockdown, if you were actually importing goods from China, it was taking a lot longer because they weren't producing them as much. So all these things need to be considered when coming up with the plan and what you're going to be doing in the future. So Heidi, can you ask the next question, please? Give it about another 20 seconds and then we'll close the poll. All right, thank you again to all those that have answered. So I'll end the poll and I'll share the results. So they're very much what I was expecting. Artificial intelligence is what I was talking about there, about being able to use the data to help protect the future, and also looking at whether it's a seasonal cycle or what type of cycle. So it can actually go out and help give you a guidance on what's going to be happening in the future. The other one is robotics and automation, is the other big one. And that's also happening a lot with a lot of people doing robotics to not only from a production line perspective, but also from a process perspective, seeing what things can be done by machine learning. And I've just had a mental blank on the type of things. But yeah, it helps you a lot on getting processes which can be automated, actually automated by remembering the keystrokes and making it somebody's doing that as a process rather than having an individual do it, which actually helps the overall job. So now close that down. And next one. So the next one is the working from multiple forecasts, and that I have been sort of going on about that, where having the different teams working in silos needs to sort of, in my view, end, because it's very difficult if each person's working to a different forecast. You walk into a meeting and you're actually spending the first half an hour saying whose numbers are right, what's going on here, why you got that number, why have you got that number, and it actually isn't helping the organisation go forward. So by having everybody working off the same numbers and agreeing on the process, so that, for example, that the sales forecast their numbers, supply, and then you work on combining those numbers and choosing which one has the best fit, and then the finance adding their part in, or using the sales and the supply as the basis, and then saying, oh, these are the additions we've done and this is why we've done them, right? In case that, for example, they might know that there's a massive merger and acquisition happening, which the sales and supply team might know about, but that's going to have a major impact on the overall numbers. So by having everybody working from the same set of numbers, it actually means that everybody knows what's going on when they're announced and also understands what's going out. Also, because you then have everything in the one system, you then understand that where's the data, what are we going to need from a raw material perspective if you actually have a production line, or what do we need to actually import from overseas by a certain date to ensure that we don't have any stockouts and we can actually meet the customer's requirements. Now, this actually is very important, as you know, especially if you have a marketing event coming on or a sales price discount going. You don't want to give a customer a discount and then run out of the stock a week, 2 days after it happens, right? Unless that was the game that you were aiming for. But normally you want to try and get as much out the door at that sales price to ensure that you actually achieve your objectives. And also, having everything working in the one environment, you can actually ensure the inventories are aligned. And that's where I was talking about, is having a system which actually tells you where your stock is. So is it in a distribution warehouse? Is it in a state distribution center? Or is it in a locality, right? So you might have a number of different locations where you're actually selling the goods. And you might also have distribution warehouses, and you might say, oh, we've got this particular good that's in South Australia and the shop has got 100 of them, but we've only got 5 here in New South Wales. Let's get 60 or 70 of those back from South Australia rather than having to get them made, or where we might have to order 200, right? So it helps you rearrange your inventories to ensure that you are ensuring that you're using your inventory efficiently, but also ensures that you are not stocking out in some areas where you are majorly oversupplied in other areas. And this also gives a better overall streamline to the whole process because everybody's talking and understanding what's going on, and helps you manage the risks a lot better than what they were being managed. So this one is one that people don't normally think about, in my view, is that a lot of people, when they do an AI type of environment, they do look at their historical data. But if you're only looking at your historical data, that's only one part of the organization. You actually need to look at the whole structure of the organization. So you need to understand what the strategic plans are from the C-suite. You need to understand, is there any uncertainty that you can actually forecast? Like the pandemic, nobody could have forecast that, or the world war in Ukraine. They were sort of things outside of anybody's control. But as soon as we became aware of them, we needed to be able to update our forecast to take those type of events into the forecast or the plan. And that's very difficult to do if it's all in a spreadsheet, because it takes a lot of time and effort to enable that to happen. So you need to make sure, or marketing trends or weather events. So for example, when we were having the floods in New South Wales, if you actually had something that was in that environment, or people now talking about blackouts happening, if you sell generators, you might need to increase production to meet the demand that might be happening shortly. So there's those type of things. You have to understand what's going around in the environment and the market to ensure that you can take that into account and add those events into your forecast by either saying, okay, this is a certain event that might happen, and doing what if scenarios. Because if you can't do what if scenarios that gives you a result in half an hour or an hour or a couple of hours, depending on how many SKUs are impacted, right? If it takes days, by the time you get it, it might be too late to actually act on it, or the whole things that you want to then do a scenario on might have changed, and then you've got to go back and rework for another 3 weeks. So you're actually spending more time actually building the numbers rather than analysing the numbers and providing the necessary information to management. And this is where I was talking about forecasts being overruled. And this is where people are saying, well, they're in their area, they don't really know what's happening in the overall business, so we'll overwrite their numbers, right? And that's actually can have major impacts. They could be setting an expectation to management that you won't actually achieve because they're overstating the numbers. I used to have a general manager back in the day who would always be trying to forecast 120%, 130% what he's actually achieved in the past. And I'd be going to him and saying, look, I know you want to forecast 130% to make sure that you look good to senior management, but you haven't been hitting it. We should really go for 100% because that's what you have been hitting on a regular basis. And we know that you've been hitting that. And if you hit 130, well, then you've over exceeded, which is always better to give to management than to under. And trying to get that through to some people is very difficult. But if you're all working in the one environment and you can actually talk through the logic behind how things have come up, you can reduce manual errors, but also by being automated, you can do a lot more what if scenarios, which help the organization aim for their strategic goals and achieve them. Number 5 is difficulty handling uncertainty, right? And that's what I was sort of talking about. Everybody has their best laid plans where they try to say, okay, this is what we're going to achieve based on what we know today. And we have done this all in a spreadsheet and it's not going to be any problems. But if there is a say, for example, you've got a warehouse that's near a river and that river floods and you lose all your stock, right? What are you going to do? How are you going to get around that? Can you actually get the stock quickly from another location, or is it something that's going to take 3 months to bring in? So therefore, you need to start looking at all those type of events and start putting in a resilient way of interconnecting things between what could happen and what might happen, but also what usually does happen, right? And ensuring that you actually have a way of doing these type of things, and looking at what's there from a roadblock perspective, right? So is it a technical one, a communication one? Is it a procedural? So what is actually stopping you from getting to where you want to be as an organization, and how can you actually improve that? Sometimes in this current environment, you might actually have more success in saying, look, we need to actually, going back to one of the first survey questions where people are saying a lot of it's still being done in spreadsheets. Given the company's turnovers, you might need to be able to say, look, we can't give you the right information in a timely manner and you've seen that recently, especially with what's happened over the last few years. We actually need a more automated process to ensure that the information you are getting is more accurate, and we can use that to ensure that we don't become overstocked. We don't actually order more than we should order from a certain location because we had a misinformation in our spreadsheet. We might have said we wanted a 5% increase and we put a 45% increase or whatever, right? So the more things you can actually get out and make it easier to understand things, makes it easier for the organization, again, to get to its results. I know we keep talking about the manual data, but that is a very big thing, right? Because without having ways of looking at data, if you're just doing things in a spreadsheet, you can't use AI technology. You can't use drill down technology. You can't use the ability to change products halfway throughout the year. Say, okay, for the first half, it's going to be product A. Then we know we're going to actually do something different, and we're going to actually change it and make maybe just do different packaging, right? Or the other one that you've got is we've got some stock and it's actually got an expiry date, right? If you don't know about, it might be in a system somewhere, but if it's not being notified to the people in the right time, well, you can't do any sales promotions or marketing events to try and get rid of that old stock, well, nearly old stock or expired stock that you need to be able to get rid of before it does expire, because otherwise you've got a very big stock loss and wastage, right? So we need to be doing things from an overall perspective to see, okay, how can we ensure that we try and keep wastage to a minimum, not only when we're actually producing goods, but also when we're selling them, right? And this is where we can look at the manual processes, and they can't really tell you, but an automated process that basically says, okay, each of these different production lines have these type of items which have this type of expiry date, and you'll get a warning about it being expired, and you can see how much you've got and then make a decision on what you do. So for example, if you've got maybe 100,000 items expiring, you're in big trouble. But if you've got maybe 100, you might say, okay, we might do a special in one specific shop where we know that this item is sold the most based on our history that we can get from the system. So it helps you understand what's going on, where it's happening. But trying to do all that in a spreadsheet with manual intervention is very difficult, especially if you need a quick turnaround time. So that's another thing to consider. Excuse me for a minute. So what this means by fragmented architects is basically everybody working for their own end result, which we have been talking about a lot today, but it does come in to overall, right? They're all, as you can see, all these 8 points are interrelated, and some of the points are just looking at the same problem, but they're looking at it from a different angle, because sometimes you might be doing some of the other items correctly, but then this one might be the one that's causing the most pain, right? And this is where the financial people are going out and telling senior management, okay, this is the revenue we're going to get, this is the cost of goods we're going to have, this is the profit we're going to make, and this is how we're going to achieve it, right? And I haven't even talked to the supply chain people or the inventory people, right? And that causes major problems because supply chain might say, well, they're forecasting that we're going to actually have a year-on-year growth of 35%, but we're not actually putting on any extra staff for sales. We're not actually putting on any other marketing events. And currently, based on our forecast, either manual or hopefully with AI, it's showing that we've only got a 15% possible growth. So how are we going to get that extra 20%, right? Without having the interaction between each of the different people and talking to each other and looking at what you can do, it's very difficult to actually plan for that. So with the integrated business plan, you can actually go through and say, okay, this is what we are thinking is going to happen from a planning perspective. That can then flow down, and the supply chain can say, okay, this is where we've got our issues. And then you can say, okay, to meet the overall plan, we need to be able to sell this. To sell this, we need to buy this type of raw materials, which then flows through to the cost. We also need to have these extra staff on because the current staff, or we need to improve our web-based technology so that we can actually do more on a web marketplace rather than doing it via face-to-face salesmen, or we need to start doing specials through shops because that's where our biggest things are going. So you need to look at all these different items, and if it's not in a system or you're not talking to each other, it's very difficult to do that because you will miss opportunities, and you will underachieve possibly because the right people aren't involved in any decisions. Okay. One of the biggest things that we have been seeing is that with supply chain, you need to make sure that you're able to meet your customers' orders when they fall due, right? So if you can't predict when you need to have the inventory and you're hoping it based on past that you'll always have enough, you might actually find out that you're actually overstocked in one area where you thought, oh, this is where we're going to have the growth, but you're understocked in another area where there was more chance of growth and it is actually happening. So you need to understand all these different areas and bring in the customer satisfaction actually into your supply chain planning, right? Because if you just focus on this is what the company strategy is and this is the profit the company wants to make and this is how we're going to get there and these are all the different items that need to be considered, you are very unlikely to actually meet the results that you want to do. And another area that I forgot to add to the slides, because it's actually number 9, is looking at it from a change management area, because when you're bringing in a new process, you need to make sure that all the users are involved, right? If the users aren't involved and somebody just says, okay, we're going to bring the system in, it makes it very difficult for that to achieve its end result, because the people need to know exactly what's going on, and they need to understand that all these different things play together, and it's not looking at trying to replace somebody with AI. As soon as you mention AI, that's one of the things that normally happens, that people say, well, I'm going to be out of a job because AI is going to do it. And to that end, that it's very much how it's sold to the actual users. I've heard of a story where I used to work for IBM, and we had a system called Watson, which was used for artificial intelligence. They actually used that to look at cancer patients and work out what needs to be done, but they still made recommendations to doctors, and doctors looked at what was recommended and then chose the best. So AI is really there, and also in supply chain software, AI is what is there to help companies decide what is the best thing that they can do, and make suggestions. It's not saying it has to be done this way, it's just making suggestions. It still needs somebody with the right company knowledge and the right information to use that data and become, as we say, a trusted advisor, right? If we could do the next 2 poll questions, please. I'll give it another 30 seconds for the last few to enter if they want to, and then we'll mock it up and I'll show you the answers. All right, thank you all very much for answering again. So I'll share the results. Basically, this is where we can see that industry networking is the big thing, and that's very good to see. And because you're talking to people who are using the different softwares, and they make advice that can be used. And then, as you can see, it's sort of when you start looking down the bottom of it, what is the key feature the organisation is looking for? The biggest one is the probabilistic forecasting or AI, but apart from that, it's very evenly spread, which is very interesting to see, right? So the companies are looking for different things, and this probably all comes back to the industry you're in, and what actually is the pain point that you've actually encountered especially over the last 3 years, where supply chain has really been very much in focus, as we know, especially if you're, as we all know from COVID with the toilet paper issues and some of the other, even recently we had with the floods, we had the ability to get frozen chips being impacted because of the weather. So all these things do come into it, and understanding how the scheduling goes and integrations and everything, it's all very important. So thank you very much all for that feedback. Now, basically, there's just one last slide, and then we'll open the floor for questions. So basically, we at Wolters Kluwer, we actually have AI-based technology where we can actually take data from a number of years. And some people say, oh, we only need a couple of years of history. We prefer to have as much history as possible, because the more history you have, the better it is to actually work on what is the true cycle, whether it is a seasonal or whether it's a promotion driven, or which one it is, and helps you to do that. We're able to connect to numerous different systems. That doesn't, we're not one system. It can be SAP, Oracle, Microsoft, to get the source data from, or any of the other, JD Edwards or any of the others. But we are able to do demand and supply planning. We can do production planning, and we can, of course, link it into our planning and forecasting, because Wolters Kluwer, CCH Tagetik, we are not only a company that sells supply chain software, we also sell ESG software, consolidation, lease accounting, things to help the operations and finance people improve how they're doing things and automate it, so that they can become more of a trusted advisor rather than just doing things manually. Because if you're doing things manually, you actually walk in and you get swamped with questions. So one of the systems I implemented, we changed the forecast process from 3 days to 3 hours, but we didn't tell management, and they actually spent the next 2.5 days looking at the numbers and comparing it to forecast and working out why things didn't occur as expected. And then they walked into meetings and actually provided the numbers, but then answers. So they actually then started being able to offer suggestions on what needs to be done to improve going forward, rather than just walking in and being reactive. They were actually becoming predictive. So the types of software that are out there these days can actually help organizations improve how they're doing things. Doing things in spreadsheets these days, a lot of companies still do it. However, it's got their own inherent risks, especially if they're very complex spreadsheets, which are interlinked and macro driven or VB code driven. It means that if the person who wrote it leaves, then the organization is in trouble. So we believe that our product can help you mitigate your risk, make your supply chain more resilient, which a lot of companies are now looking for, and help you become more organised and able to reach your strategic goals. And on that note, I thank you for your time, and we're now open for any questions. Over to you, Heidi.
Yeah, so if anyone have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom window. No, you can just type in the chat. Ralph will be able to answer.
Well, it doesn't look like anybody wants to ask any questions.
Ralph, you did a great job.
Oh, someone's raised their hand.
Yeah.
Roy's raised his hand. Where's Roy? Yep, Roy, go ahead, ask the question. How can we encourage our stakeholders during an assessment routine to increase engagement? That's a very good question, David. Oh, Camille, sorry. It is a very difficult one, especially trying to get the stakeholders to understand the implications and trying to, basically, we need to sell them how that we need their involvement, right? If we just say, okay, we need the involvement, they don't understand. Some of them just think, oh, you're just doing that because you can't do it yourself. But you need to be able to show them that we need their involvement to ensure that we're covering all the different angles. Because as I was saying, if you're only considering one part of the operation, you're actually missing a number of items that will help you achieve your end strategic goal. So you need to be able to say to them, look, can you please help us, because we need to understand what you're doing in this marketing space, because if we don't understand the different marketing options you're doing and what you're hoping to gain by doing that marketing, we can't take that into our supply and demand planning, which means that we could actually not have the stock to do what you want us, which will actually do more harm to the organization than good. So you might have spent a lot of money doing a marketing event, but then customers start walking in asking for that product and you don't have any stock, or you might be able to make it for months. A very good example of that, and that wasn't actually a marketing event, but it was somebody, one of these influencers was talking about a product that was used instead of sugar soap, because we were going to do some painting around our house and we wanted to use this other product because we were told how good it was from a friend. So we went looking for it, and basically 2 weeks beforehand, this influencer had gone online, and now it's out of stock until late May, early June, which means that nobody could buy it for 6 weeks. So this is some of the events that you have got no control over, but you need to be able to react to very quickly to ensure that you don't lose all those sales as people then start looking for different products. And that's how you've got to get them engaged, by saying, we need your knowledge and we need your information. Otherwise, we won't be able to achieve the result that you want to do from a strategic perspective. So I hope that answered the question. And where's
yeah, and
Sarah's
I saw
got a
that
question?
Sarah, oh good, she typed a question.
The impact of industrial actions in a broad sense, business sales and stock. Yep, very much. That's a very true statement, Sarah. Like, you've got no control over when the unions decide to pull out, but that does also impact it. You also have got you don't actually have any control over when companies go bankrupt. So as we know, recently you've actually had 2 frozen food transport companies go bankrupt, right? And that had a major impact on Coles and Woolworths and IGA and also Aldi, because they couldn't actually get their stock to their locations because nobody could transport it. So you've also got to then think about backup plans or what other options, and especially with companies now being impacted by the increase in fuel prices, which impacts on distribution costs. You need to understand how we did it before. Is that how we need to do it in the future? One of the studies I did read was, for example, FedEx in America, when they were doing their deliveries, they actually did a study and they worked out if the trucks could do 90% left-hand turns, they actually reduced their runs by an hour and a half. And the reason for that was because they weren't driving across traffic. They were always going with traffic, which made it very interesting that they had to rearrange a lot of their runs to say, okay, you've got to go out right to go first, and then after that you go left all day, because we know that will actually get you back here quicker and actually achieve a better customer satisfaction. So there's a whole lot of things you need to consider to ensure that you have those type of items, and you also don't have any control over stuff coming in from overseas. So if you're importing stuff from China and they've actually got lockdowns in China, or if they've got ships that don't want to come down to Australia, because I have heard that the amount of ships coming down to Australia when COVID first finished had reduced dramatically, because the turnaround time here on the docks was a lot slower than some of the turnaround times, say, in Singapore. So some shipping companies made a call not to come to Australia because they knew they could actually make more money by going to the countries with a quicker turnaround than coming here, which impacted a lot of organisations as well. And some of them had to even freight stuff here by air. And even that was difficult because we weren't having as many planes flying here. So it delayed things coming. So there's all these different things you need to take into account. And that's one of the things which a system can do in some cases, where you can say, okay, this is my A supplier, but this is my backup supplier. So you can actually maybe reach out to them and say, okay, what's your turnaround time? And they might be faster than your normal supplier. They might also be a little bit more expensive, right? But you might be prepared to pay that expense because you can get the goods now and not have to wait for 2 months, which impacts your overall inventory. So very good point, Sarah. Any other questions? Very good question, Kamal. Especially with companies, building companies going broke, and a lot of them going broke because they had fixed price contracts, but the price of their supplies have gone up dramatically. I suppose that you can also, with AI, you could sort of say that's a similar type of building, and say, okay, we sold to this supplier previously and they were building a block of units. They're building another block of units, and then try and do a comparison using that type of stage. And also I do know from auditing a construction company that it can be very difficult trying to get them to stay to the stages because of weather and other events that impact them, or they've got less staff than they were expecting, and it's delaying things. So it is very difficult to forecast from a supply perspective, but hopefully they would give you, this is where you might need to work a bit more closer with them, right? Because you've actually signed a contract with them, they could actually reach out to them and say, okay, what is your forecast and when you expect to need it? And then you could actually put that into a system that it then could update it. And they must be forecasting on a regular basis, and you maybe as part of the contract, you say, you need to give us an update on your forecast on a monthly basis when you do it yourselves, so that we can make sure that we're able to meet your demand when it comes due. Because if we're working based on just what we know in-house, that's going to be different to something where you might have actually been delayed by a concrete pour due to weather. So something you were expecting next week, you now want to push out for 2 weeks. Well, you need to let us know as soon as possible so that we can make sure we can do it. So it's actually working a lot closer with your customer. And by doing that, you're actually going to be doing 2 things. One, improving the accuracy of your forecast, but also improving your customer relations, and hopefully in making them seeing that you actually want to be there for them and meet their demand exactly when it's required, which actually could give you brownie points for future contracts. So. Sarah, that as I talked about, government doing, inflation will continue to bite. The impact of power purchase will reduce the stock and the company's ability. Yes, inflation always comes into play, but as it is at the moment, it is starting to plateau, we believe, based on everything I'm reading and seeing. The one that is actually coming to bite very much so is power prices. But that's where some companies are actually using it as an opportunity, where they're sort of saying, okay, if they've got the capability, they're actually using some of their funds to look at trying to get power from different sources, whether it be solar power actually on their roofs, which they actually then store in a huge battery. So there is batteries out there that can actually store power for up to 12 hours. And if it's just for your factory, it will actually be able to run the factory for 12 hours. So there is ways and means around it. So it means that you need to start, companies need to start looking at opportunities of how they're going to do things and what other options are out there, rather than saying, okay, this is how we've always done it and this is what we're going to do go forward. What can we do different, right? How can we start doing some brainstorming and looking at different design and saying, okay, this is how we do it today, but maybe we need to move to a place which has got hydropower, right? So maybe move down to Tasmania for production because they won't have the same issues that we have here in New South Wales, right? That's a big change, right? Or you might be able to move closer to a different location, where they've got a lot of solar power and you can have a battery and you can put solar power in a new factory because it's cheaper to build there. So different options are available, and that's where you need to start looking at what you can do to ensure that you can still price the stock at the right level and still meet demand as it happens. So I hope that answered the question, Sarah. All right, I think there's no other questions, is there? Doesn't appear to be. Oh no, I don't think there's any other questions. So thank you all very much for your time. I hope you found that interesting and useful. And I'll now hand you back to Heidi.
Thanks, Ralph. And thank you all for joining us in this webinar. And thanks, Ralph, for the great presentation. I hope you find the information shared today useful and insightful. Remember to apply the knowledge gained in your work and share it with the others. The webinar recording will be shared with you and uploaded to our ASCII YouTube channel in a few days. Don't forget to check our website and for more resources and upcoming events. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.